Welcome to another episode of Rock and Roll Flashback with your host, Bill Price.
In the Rock and Roll Flashback series, recording engineers who shaped the music, I will focus on those individuals who typically remained anonymous but played an important role in music recording. In this episode, I will look at the history behind the recording engineer who first worked with the Beatles in the early 1960s. Musician, engineer, record producer, and singer Norman Smith. Norman Smith was born on February 22nd, 1923, in Edmonton, Middlesex, England. During World War II, he was trained as a Royal Air Force glider pilot. After the war, he pursued his interest in music by playing trumpet, piano, and drums in various jazz groups. However, his attempt in pursuing a music career proved unsuccessful. He then decided to try to get into music production with the BBC. He got an interview with the BBC and was asked if he had any engineering experience. Norman replied no and asked what engineering had to do with music production. He was informed that in order to get into the production department, engineering experience was required. He was then told to come back once he had some engineering experience. So in order to gain engineering experience, he took training in refrigeration engineering. After gaining engineering experience, he went back to the BBC. When he was asked about his engineering training, Norman responded with refrigeration engineering. The interviewer then stated that they meant music engineering. So for a period of time, he worked in refrigeration and went to night school to learn electronics. In 1959, he saw an ad in the Times newspaper for a recording assistant at EMI Studios. He applied for the position, got an interview, and was hired. For the next 3 years, he gained experience working his way up to the position of balance engineer. 1962 turned out to be a pivotal year for Norman and 4 young lads from Liverpool. The Beatles were scheduled for a recording test at EMI Studios on January 6th. As fate would have it, Norman was the engineer on duty, so he became the Beatles' recording engineer. Typically, there were 4 in-house producers, and each one had an assistant. Usually for new artist tests, it was the assistant producer that handled the audition. But on this occasion, Norman was surprised that instead of the assistant, George Martin, the head of EMI's Parlophone label, showed up. Then the 4 Beatles came into EMI's studio number 2. Norman then left the control room and went to the studio to introduce himself. He noticed that John and George's guitar amplifiers were quite small. Norman then returned to the control room and was surprised at how noisy the amplifiers were and determined that they were not suitable for the audition. So he and a technical engineer brought some equipment from the echo chamber to replace the noisy amplifiers. It was typical EMI practice to use screens to isolate the sounds of the various instruments. However, Norman decided to ignore the practice and record the Beatles as though they were performing live. The gamble would ultimately prove to be the best way to record the band for the initial recording sessions. Later, the press began referring to the Beatles' recordings as the Mercy sound. Norman would later receive letters and phone calls from the U.S. inquiring as to how he was able to achieve that sound on tape. Although the first impression of the band was not great, George Martin sensed their potential, which led to signing the Beatles to a recording contract in July. 3 months after their test recording, the Beatles returned to EMI for their first recording session on September 4th. The sessions, which lasted until November, produced 2 singles, one released in October and the other in January 1963. Norman's assistant engineer was Richard Lanham, who brought with him a young 15-year-old new hire to sit in on the sessions. His name was Jeff Emmerich, who interestingly would later go on to become the Beatles' engineer. In a future episode of Recording Engineers Who Shaped the Music, I will focus on the career of Geoff Emerick, the Beatles' second recording engineer. In February 1963, the Beatles recorded 10 tracks in a marathon session that lasted just under 10 hours. 4 songs from their first 2 singles were added to the 10 tracks and released on the album titled Please Please Me. Perhaps the most significant track was the cover version of the Isley Brothers' Twist and Shout. John Lennon was suffering from a bad cold, and it's amazing that he was able to make it through the entire session. By the time they were to record the last track, Twist and Shout, John's voice was nearly gone. 2 takes were attempted, but the first take was the one that was included on the album. Interestingly, John Lennon began using the nickname Normal when addressing or referring to Norman. Soon the other Beatles also started using the nickname. Norman engineered all of the Beatles' EMI studio recordings until 1965, when he was promoted to producer. The final album that he worked on was Rubber Soul. During his time as the Beatles' engineer, he recorded nearly 100 songs. In addition to the Beatles, Norman also worked with Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. In 1967, Norman started working with a psychedelic rock band that he had seen perform at London's UFO Club, which went by the name of Pink Floyd. The band was signed to EMI with Norman as their producer. They recorded 3 albums. During one of the recording sessions, drummer Nick Mason became agitated because he could not play the right drum part on one of the songs. So Norman, being a former drummer, stepped in and played the drum part himself. Then in 1968, Norman produced one of the first concept albums titled SF Sorrow by the band called Pretty Things. And in 1971, he also produced recordings by Barclay James Harvest. In 1971, Norman then entered another phase of his career by recording a demo of a song that he had written with the intention of having John Lennon record it. However, when Norman played the demo for fellow producer Mickey Most, he was impressed and advised Norman to release the demo as is. The single titled Don't Let It Die was released under the name Hurricane Smith and climbed to number 2 in the UK. Then in 1972, he scored a hit on both sides of the Atlantic with Oh Babe, What Would You Say? In the US, the single reached the number 1 position in Cashbox and number 3 on the Billboard Pop charts. In Canada, it climbed to number 3 in the RPM magazine chart and number 4 in the UK singles chart. When the single knocked Elton John's Crocodile Rock from number 1 on the Cashbox chart, John Lennon sent a telegram congratulating Norman. In 1972, Oh Babe, What Would You Say was an unlikely hit, since the arrangement was based on the style of popular songs from the 1930s. According to Norman, the song's lyrics were essentially a true story of his life. He would go to a ballroom, but being shy, couldn't even ask a girl to dance. So he would walk home imagining a romance that couldn't even evolve. The song was essentially about those experiences in an era from a long time ago. Norman's self-titled album also included a UK single, a cover of Gilbert O'Sullivan's songs Who Was It? Additional recordings were made, however, they were not successful. In March 2007, Norman's memoir, titled John Lennon Called Me Normal, was issued as a limited edition at the Fest for Beatles fans held in Secaucus, New Jersey. At the event, Norman sang Oh Babe, What Would You Say? Billy J. Kramer, an old friend that Norman had not seen for many years, made a surprise appearance to greet him. The following year, Norman Smith passed away in March at the age of 85. It can be argued that the success of the Beatles can be attributed to Norman Smith. If he had not deviated from EMI's standard practice and opted for a different approach in how to record the band, it is likely that the Beatles' sound would not have had the same impact. So for daring to ignore the EMI practice, Norman deserves a thank you. Here is Norman Hurricane Smith singing his hit from 1972, "Oh Babe, What Would You Say?"
Suddenly be sunshine on a cold and rainy day. Oh, babe, what would you say? For there are you, sweet lollipop. Here am I with such a lot to say. Hey, hey, just to walk with you along the Milky Way. Through the nighttime, bring you flowers every day. Oh, babe, what would you say? 'Cause, oh, baby, I know I could be so in love with you. And I know that I could make you love me too.
This has been Rock and Roll Flashback with a look back at the multifaceted career of Norman Smith, the engineer who was instrumental in recording the early Beatles. And until next time, I'm your host, Bill Price.
So what?
rock on, rock on, rock on, rock on, rock on, rock on.